So tonight we're going to be in Acts of the Apostles 3, and this is lesson 9, and we're going to be in Acts chapter 25 this evening. And also we want to examine the question of why does Paul appeal his case to Caesar, which I kind of gripped my attention a little bit. And so I thought a bit about this, where Paul says in Acts chapter 25, if we could just kind of go there, and then we'll look at this generally throughout all these chapters, because it's kind of a big picture thing going on. Paul appealing his case to Caesar and going to Rome eventually. So Acts chapter 25, verse 10, then said Paul, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat where I ought to be judged. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as thou very well knowest. For if I be an offender or have committed anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. But if there be none of these things whereof these accuse me, no man may deliver me unto them. I appeal unto Caesar. So, and then later on, after he meets with Agrippa, and Agrippa hears his whole testimony, Agrippa even says, if he didn't appeal to Caesar, we would have let the guy go. But did Paul want to be let go in a way? And I ask why? Why is Paul appealing? Why is he pushing for this? Because perhaps he could have been let go, but there's something in him that's driving him to Rome. So why is he appealing his case to Caesar? So that was interesting, at least to me. So when something's interesting to me, guess what? I try to get you interested in it. That's what I like to do. So let's look at the notes, though, and then we'll get to the sheet that I just gave you. So phase 2, now in the trial. So Paul is in Caesarea. He's standing trial, and it's chapter 4, and he stood before Governor Felix. We looked at that last week, and in this. Let's just back up for a moment. Let's just back up. Let's just stop for a second, actually. Let's go back to when Paul is first arrested. And he makes 2 defenses, right? So let's just get that flow. He makes one defense, and he gives his testimony in that first defense. That's Acts chapter 22. That's on page 23. His first defense. He gives his testimony to the Sanhedrin. And he was uninterrupted, and I've said this before, when he said what word? When he gave his testimony in that first defense, he was interrupted when he said the word Gentile. So then Claudius Lysias gives him another shot at the Sanhedrin. He makes a second defense, and Paul proclaims the resurrection. And that set them off there in his second defense. He witnessed of the resurrection. So then after that, there was the plot to kill Paul, and then they brought him to Caesarea. So now he's there on this civil trial before the Roman political rulers. And the first phase of that trial, he's before Governor Felix. Who's the lawyer of the high priest? Remember him? Tertullus. You have to know him. Yeah. Tertullus, he's on page 25. Because he is the consummate, as he is falsely accusing Paul and falsely blaming even Claudius Lysias of being the violent one when he wasn't. So we looked at that last week. And then what a great witnessing example at the end of chapter 24 in Acts. And really it would make a great Bible study anytime to just talk about how Paul witnessed to Felix. And he reasoned with this man who was just very selfish, self-motivated, looking for bribes, looking to use Paul as a pawn for his own benefit. And yet Paul sought to witness to him. And he told Felix about what? Of righteousness, which he did not have and needed. The righteousness of Jesus Christ. Number 2, of temperance, Now, how does temperance relate to his lack of righteousness? Yeah, it was his giving into temptations and his love of money and his greed for power. He had no temperance. He had no self-control. And therefore, he had no heart to really have the righteousness of Christ. And then so Paul witnessed to him of righteousness, of temperance, and of judgment to come. So that's really good. Those three things that Paul witnessed to Felix. And Felix's wife is also given there. We mentioned her name was Drusilla. Does anybody have that as a middle name? No? No Drusilla's here? Okay. Okay, so we finished there last week. So now Felix just fades away. He is no longer governor, and it's Festus comes in because Festus has taken Felix's place. So Festus has inherited Paul as a prisoner. What is he going to do with him? That's basically chapter 25. So Festus comes into the province, and what does it say in chapter 25, verse 1? Look at that. He ascended from where to where? And so why does it say that again? Because Jerusalem is on a hill. And so it's always they're going up to Jerusalem. So he went and he ascended to Jerusalem. And there he met the high priest. And what does the high priest ask Festus? A favor. Verse 3, what does he want Festus to do? Send Paul where? Jerusalem. Yeah, so Festus is in Jerusalem, and the high priest is saying, call for Paul. You're here, I'm here. Have Paul come. Why does he want Paul to come? Get killed. Paul won't even make it there if he is sent. So it's another plot. So Festus insists that Paul remain in Caesarea, verses 1 through 4. And it's a good thing because, and here's the bullet point, the blank, good thing, as there was a renewed what? Plot of the Sanhedrin to kill Paul if he returned to Jerusalem. And so Festus is adamant, verse 4, he says, Paul will be kept at Caesarea. And then Festus is saying, I'm going to leave here soon. I'm going back to Caesarea. And he says in verse 5, if you want to meet Paul and you want to have a trial with Paul and you want to accuse him so that we can have a trial and see what he did wrong, you come down to Caesarea. But Paul's not coming to Jerusalem. So again, God is providential. How many times did God save Paul's life? So here, Festus doesn't even really know he's saving Paul's life. There's not Claudius Lysias. He's not here anymore. It's just God just prevents Festus from having Paul moved to Jerusalem at this time. And that saves Paul's life. So God always knows what's best for us. Mm-hmm. So in verses 5 through 8, then, we see Paul is unjustly accused by the Jews. So verse 6 says that Festus tarried among them for 10 days. In other words, he stayed in Jerusalem for 10 days. And then he went down to Caesarea. And then the next day he went onto the judgment seat and has Paul brought. And it says, and when he was come, the Jews which came down from Jerusalem, so they did that. They went down to Caesarea in order to accuse Paul. They stood around about him. And they laid many and what? What does it say? Grievous complaints against Paul, which they could not prove. So number two, Paul is unjustly accused by the Jews. Grievous is weighty. They were saying, you have committed high crimes and misdemeanors. When Paul had not committed any high crimes or misdemeanors. But they put weighty transgressions upon him. Burdensome, severe. The word grievous is severe. It says charges. Now, a key word throughout these chapters, by the way, and it comes over and over again, is that they accuse him, that they're throwing accusations at Paul over and over again. But they could not prove them. So Paul answers for himself. And so let's read that verse. Maureen, could you please read Acts 25, verse 8, please? Paul answers these many charges. He answers them all in this way. Verse 8.
While he answered for himself, neither against the law of the Jews, neither against the temple, nor yet against Caesar, have I offended anything at all.
Okay, so what's the summary there? Three things. What were the three things? Paul says, I have not offended in what three areas? Against who? Against the law of the Jewish law, the word of God, against Caesar. He'd broken no laws against the Roman government and against the temple, because that's what they were accusing him of. He's not offended anything. And so then, now notice like verse 9, and it shows you too that there's some kind of a relationship between Festus, and they're always trying to, I think, smooth things over or to show that they're willing to get along or make some compromises for their own, but it's all for their own political benefit. Again, what Festus asks here, I would submit to you, he's not doing it because he's being gracious or compliant to the Jewish people. He's doing this because his job will be easier if he can kind of appease the Jewish people. So he says to the Jews, he says to Paul, would you go to Jerusalem? Because that's where they want him to go. Will you go to Jerusalem? And Paul had better sense. So Paul refuses to go to Jerusalem, but appeals to go to Caesar's judgment seat. Paul knew ultimately, and I think this plays into it, I believe this plays into it quite a bit. Paul knew his final destination was where? Rome. Why did he know that? God told him. Didn't God tell him? When the Lord stood beside him in Acts 22, he says, thou must bear witness also at Rome. So that's going to play into it. But why does God want Paul to go to Rome? And that's leading Paul to appeal to Caesar. And that's what he even says in this passage in Acts chapter 25 and down in these verses. So, and I already read them as we started the class tonight. So we see again, God preserved Paul's life. I've lost count. We should have kept count of how many times God preserved his life. But now go to the sheet that I gave you. And I was going to make you write all this out. And I said, no, I won't do that. I wrote just a few blanks in there. And I did this kind of quickly. So, and this kind of summary of these chapters, I'm just thinking, what's going on here a little bit in Paul's civil trial? And then, especially in this question, why is Paul appealing to Caesar? So, and as I put this together, here's the points that I would share with you. Number one, throughout this trial, Paul categorically and effectively denied the grievous charges. I use that word that we just looked at in chapter 25. He denied the grievous charges against him, and he did it numerous times. Back in chapter 24, when he was accused before Felix and the Sanhedrin, and when Tertullus was lying against him, Paul defended himself. So Paul defended himself. And it's kind of interesting to see a comparison here between Paul and Jesus. Jesus didn't appeal his case to Caesar. Jesus didn't defend himself, but Paul does. Nehemiah in the Old Testament, when he was accused, falsely accused, he defended himself too. So if you're falsely accused and it could destroy your testimony and your witness for Christ, you can defend yourself in order to witness for Christ. And that's really what's driving Paul through this as well. But Acts 24, verse 13, Paul says, they cannot prove the things they're accusing me of. And there's that word I said is repeated over, accusing, they're accusing. They cannot prove these things. And in the midst of all these accusations, what gave Paul the power to witness and defend himself against all these charges? Chapter 23, verse 1. What does it say there? He had a what? A clear conscience. And also, he says it in chapter 24, 16. He says, herein do I exercise myself to have always a conscience void of offense. So in order to really stand and defend the integrity, your integrity and the integrity of God and his truth and his word, we have to have what? We have to have a clear conscience. We have to be walking with God. We have to have our sins confessed. We have to be living right before God and man so that we could have confidence and a clear conscience. So Paul maintained a clear conscience throughout this trial. I just put that as number 2. Now, what did the Jews want to happen to Paul?
Dead.
They wanted him what?
Dead.
Dead. That's right. So they wanted a death sentence against Paul. And it says it in chapter 25, verse 11. And who could read that verse? Who could read that one? Sid, why don't we start on the back and we'll work around from there. 25:11 of Acts.
Or if I be an offender, have committed anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. But if there be none of these things whereof these accuse me, then man may deliver me unto them. I appeal to Caesar.
Okay. Now look also in verse 24 and 25. Ruth, can you read 24 and Eunice 25, please?
And Festus said, King Agrippa, and all men which are here present with us, ye see this man, about whom all the multitude of the Jews have dealt with me, both at Jerusalem and also here, crying that he ought not to live any longer.
Okay, so let me just underline that. What did the Jews want? They did not want Paul to live any longer. They wanted him dead, right? Verse 25.
But when I found that he had committed nothing worthy of death, and that he himself hath appealed to Augustus, I have determined to send him.
Okay, so the Jewish people wanted a death sentence. Now, according to what Paul says in verse 11, I'm just going to branch off just for a moment on this point. Do you believe Paul believed in the death sentence based on what Paul said there?
Yeah.
Why?
Because he said, I refuse not to die if I did something wrong.
Yeah. So does the Bible teach that there are certain crimes that it is a just punishment for someone to receive a death penalty? Yes?
Yeah.
Where? Other than this verse. Okay, that's a verse right there. Actually, I believe we could use it. You got the verse? You got a verse? Back it up. Back it up. Back it up with the Bible. Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. Where's that? That's before the law. That's after the flood. That's Genesis. Since you're not sure where it is. Do you know where that is? Because people are going to ask you this. Unsaved people are going to say, well, you believe in a death. You're cruel. You're unloving. They might accuse you of that. Well, what does the Bible say? In Genesis chapter 9 and verse 6, whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God created he him. There is when Queen Athaliah was killed, somewhere in the Chronicles, and I actually don't have the scripture at the tip of my finger here, but they exercised swift judgment upon her, and she received a death penalty. Actually, it's in 2 Chronicles. Where is it? Athaliah. I should find it. When she was put to death, it says there was peace in the land. Oh yes, in 2 Chronicles. Yeah, so here it is. 2 Chronicles chapter 23. And Athaliah had her grandsons killed, slain, a whole bunch of them. I mean, she was a murderous woman. And so when they got a hold of her, they put her to death, and they did it quickly. In 2 Chronicles chapter 23
15.
and verse 15, thank you, Micah. So they laid hands on her, and when she was come to the entering of the horse gate, they slew her there. Thank you. They slew her, and it was swift penalty, swift judgment. And what was the result? And the reason I'm using this as an illustration is people say we're unloving for believing in a death penalty, but I believe it's loving to eliminate murderous people out of your realm, because they create more destruction and mayhem and sadness and woe and more death. You're protecting the innocent by putting people like this to death. And what was the result when they put her to death quickly? Verse 21. Who can read that? Who's got that? Where are we at? Frida, could you read, please? Okay, 2 Chronicles chapter 23. Micah, verse 21.
And all the people of the land rejoiced, and the city was quiet. After that, they had slain Athaliah with the sword.
Okay, the city was quiet. There was peace. So anyway, I don't want to spend the whole time on the death penalty, but a few thoughts about it. And then, of course, in Romans 13, it speaks about government. So let me ask you this. Do you believe there's ever a cause for a just war? In other words, can one nation go against another nation? Was it just for us to go defeat Hitler?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Okay, and that saved a lot of life because he was murdering all kinds of people. See, so in a sense, when one nation goes to war against another, that's a death penalty. So if you say there's no death penalty, then it's almost like you have to become a pacifist, because one nation going to war against another, people are going to die when that happens. So we do that internationally to protect us from other nations that want to kill us. Like, was anybody really sad when Baghdadi died? Was anybody sad when Bin Laden died? No, we were at peace. It brought peace because they were murderous people. You see? So in a sense, that was a death penalty upon those people. But sometimes we have to do it domestically if those enemies are here. So in that sense, so government does not bear the sword in vain. See, what does a government bear a sword for? Not to tap somebody on the wrist. Say, don't do that anymore. What's the point of a sword? What does a sword do? It puts people to death in that context, Romans 13. Okay.
Also, Pastor,
Yeah.
in the book of Numbers, where God told Moses for the people to stone to death that man that was picking whatever.
Yeah. Well, obviously the law had the death penalty throughout it. And let me ask you, does God believe in a death penalty? What's the wages of sin? Okay, so we'll stop right there. Okay, they wanted Paul dead. Paul says, I'm willing to die if I've done anything worthy of death. So for this reason, Paul appeals to Caesar. That's number 4. I'm going back to the notes. Because what did he know? He knew, did the Jewish authorities, did the Sanhedrin have the legal right to put him to death? They wanted him dead. So Paul says, okay, you want me dead? Let's appeal this case to Caesar. Because Paul knew the Jewish Sanhedrin didn't have the right to put him to death. So he's willing to bring his case to the legal authorities for this.
He's also a Roman citizen.
And he was a Roman citizen. So Roman law was required to give that verdict. But here's the incredible thing. They're accusing Paul of these different things, and we just looked at the different charges against him. Against the temple, against the law, and against the Roman laws and the law of God, which was really just their traditions. But Paul turns it around and he frames the argument that why they really want me dead is why? Because he proclaimed the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So let's look at that. As you look at this trial, this is what Paul does. He takes their false accusations and he basically says, smokescreen. It's a smokescreen. They really want me dead because I'm preaching Jesus Christ and the resurrection. So as we look at these different trials, that is what's going on. And if you even go back to chapter 23, verse 6, in his first defense to the Sanhedrin, what did Paul say in chapter 23, verse 6? And why don't we start in the back there with Maureen? Do you have 23, 6?
But when Paul perceived that the one part were Sadducees and the others Pharisees, he cried out in the council, "Men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee, of the hope and the resurrection of the dead. I am called in question."
Okay, so Paul brings it down to the matter of the resurrection, and then that created this big war between the Pharisees and Sadducees and so forth, a great cry between them. And so he frames what they really are against him about, what's really put to him is about the resurrection of Jesus Christ, because that's the only thing he has done wrong, was to preach Christ. And that's what he says back in chapter 24 and verse 15. So look at 24, verse 15, where Paul says, "I have hope toward God, which they themselves also allow, that there shall be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and the unjust." So here he's not saying just the resurrection of Christ. He's saying in the general resurrection, there is a general resurrection. And because there is a general resurrection, there is an absolute necessity that one raised from the dead. So that if we're all going to be generally raised, we don't want to be raised to stand before God and cast into hell. Because you know what? The unsaved will be raised out of the grave, right? Yes. The unsaved will come out of the grave, stand before God at the great white throne judgment, and then be cast into hell. He says there's a resurrection of the just and the unjust. And the just will have eternal life. But how can we be raised to eternal life? How can we be made just? Through Jesus Christ. You see, so Paul's saying this in verse 21 as well. He says, "Except it be for this one voice that I cried standing among you." Says the only thing you could find wrong in me, if there's any evil, basically verse 21, if you found any evil in me, it's because I am called into question about the resurrection of the dead. So Paul is framing it this way. And there's even other verses. And Paul says throughout all the trial, he always brings it back to the resurrection. So this is like ingenious of Paul, is what I'm saying. It is incredibly wise of Paul. You want to attack me on all these things? I'm going to stand and preach the resurrection of Jesus Christ to you. You know what? And that's a good way to witness. People start attacking us for this or that. We should try to bring the gospel. We must bring the gospel into it. So, number 6 is furthermore now, Paul knew that Rome would not kill him for breaking mere Jewish traditions. Or he was hoping. He was strongly hoping they wouldn't. And that's referenced in chapter 25, verses 18 through 20, even in the chapter we're in now, where Paul is saying, this is Festus. This is Festus actually kind of explaining the case to Agrippa. And he says in verse 19, this is Festus. This is the Roman governor speaking to the king, King Agrippa, verse 19. And it's kind of interesting to hear them talking about what's going on with Paul. He says, "But there were certain questions against him of their own superstition, and one Jesus, which was dead, and Paul affirmed to be alive." What's important about that? They were accusing him of little superstitions, but Paul was affirming Jesus Christ was alive. So, in other words, Paul was trying to turn the argument to the resurrection of Christ. The only thing I've done wrong is proclaim the resurrection of Christ. If you want to put me to death, it's because I'm preaching the resurrection of Christ. So Paul wants to be tried on that charge. Charge me on preaching the resurrection of Christ. Put me to death for that, Paul's saying. But he shouldn't be. And so what this verse shows is that his argument's winning out. He's framed the argument well. And that the superstitions are silly to Festus and Agrippa. They're not going to put Paul to death just because he's breaking Jewish law or tradition. So my conclusion on this is Paul could have at least two major reasons in appealing his case to Caesar. One is to witness for Jesus Christ before kings in Rome, which is really a double fulfillment there. Remember when Paul was first saved? What did God tell him? He was going to be a witness to the Gentiles and to kings. So God promised and prophesied upon Paul that he would be a witness to kings. So that's one reason why he's confident he can go to Rome. Because God told him he was going to witness to kings. He's not afraid to stand before kings and to go to Rome. And those are the two verses, Acts 9:15, Acts 23:11. So to witness for Christ before kings in Rome, which Jesus said he would do. And letter B, I believe to establish a precedent. Paul is seeking to push this case through the law, just like people do today, to establish a case law. So perhaps Paul's saying there's going to be preaching throughout the Roman Empire. What are they going to do to all the preachers? What are they going to do to the other apostles? What are they going to do when other people are starting churches all around? Are the Jewish people going to come in and want to put to death everybody who's preaching Jesus Christ? So Paul is, in a sense, at the tip of the spear, willing to bring this case to Caesar to establish a precedent, a test case, so that those coming behind him could preach freely. That's what I believe why he's doing this. So letter B would be to establish a precedent or test case for the freedom for other Christians to preach Christ. Paul was doing it for the furtherance of the gospel throughout the Roman Empire. He was doing it so others would not be ashamed, so others would not be afraid. And it just reminds us that we have to witness for Jesus Christ. We can't be ashamed of Jesus Christ. If we're ashamed in this generation, the next generation will even be more ashamed. So Paul was pushing his case because he's going to witness of the resurrection every step of the way. So that's my take on that. Is there any comments, or does that make sense? Does that make sense, Esther?
I mean, yes, it makes sense, but there is a big blank.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, did you skip that purposely, or did I skip somewhere? Sorry.
Number 6?
No, the 27, letter C.
Oh, yeah. Well, we kind of got away from 27. We got away from that. We got away from that. You see, it says excursus. That means doggy trail, rabbit trail. We kind of went on it. That means addition. So, basically, this page, I kind of just, I thought its value it's an overview of the whole trial of what is Paul doing and why, So
I had a thought which really grabbed me, 25:19, when Festus was explaining what the situation was with Paul. It reminds me of when God says, "My seed will not return void." He's actually witnessing about the death and
I know.
resurrection.
Isn't that
Again,
something?
After Paul did it, he's witnessing without even realizing he's witnessing, which is amazing.
It is amazing. Yeah, it is. It's a blessing. So, okay, so with that kind of overview in mind, let me just finish up chapter 25. So really, you might want to put this somewhere. Chapter 25 is almost like a bridge chapter, because we have Festus, having this meeting with Paul and the Jews, but then kind of Festus bringing Agrippa into the case, and now Paul is going to witness to Agrippa in the next chapter. So it's kind of like a bridge chapter where not a lot. I mean, well, there's always action, but it's like a bridge to me between the governor to the king. So letter C is phase 3. He's going to start going before King Agrippa, and here's the bridge where basically Festus brings Agrippa up to speed on the whole Paul case situation. And that's what's going on in the second part of Acts 25 from verse 13 and following. So in verse 13, it says that after certain days, King Agrippa and Bernice came to Caesarea to salute Festus. So this is a conversation then between Festus and Agrippa. Festus declares Paul's cause, verse 14. Saying there's this guy, and he just gives him a review of the whole case. There's this guy, and Felix was here, and now he's gone, and now I've got to deal with him, and help me out with this, kind of a thing. And so he explains the case to him. So Paul is in Caesarea still. Festus and Agrippa, along with his wife Bernice, are present as Paul defends and gives his testimony. So who is Agrippa? Agrippa was the last of the Herodians to rule, and was the great-grandson of Herod, who had killed the Bethlehem babies. And by the way, do you know who the Herods were the descendants of? What people group? The Edomites. Think of that. Remember what we're studying in Old Testament geography? The Herods were Edomites ruling in Israel and making judgment of Jesus Christ. Okay, so the background of the defense, and so you notice letter A. You see letter A, it says, Festus gives Agrippa an overview of the case, verses 13 to 21. There's 8 verses, boom. I went over that fast. And then Agrippa agrees to hear Paul personally, verses 22 through 27. That's the end of chapter 25. So I skipped, like I said, that's why I did that excursus. The blank there, Agrippa was the last of the Herodians to rule and was the who? The great-grandson of Herod.
Pastor C is King Agrippa.
C is Agrippa, right. So now, so far, the flow in the civil trial is he's first before Felix, and then he goes before Festus, and now he's going to King Agrippa, and he wants to appeal to the big cheese, Caesar, Augustus, the emperor of the Roman Empire. So Paul is working think of our legal channels. You start in the lower courts and you go to the higher court. So he started with the governor, he's moving to the king, and he wants to go to the emperor. So that's the flow of the trial of Paul. Okay, so we'll stop right there. And
for the quiz, what do we have to know? We have
quiz next week. Really?
You don't have to give it to us. It's okay.
No. Oh yeah, quiz. Okay, so the verse you have, right?
Yes.
Acts 26:28.
Yes.
So I just gave you what to know. The flow. The flow. From Felix to Festus to Agrippa. You should know now. Try to know a little chapter content in here. So try to keep this chapter content. Try to get the chapter content a little straight in your mind. So in other words, this quiz will be from where? Okay, here we go. The quiz will be from page 23, chapter 22. So Acts 22, the first defense. So Acts 22 is Paul's first defense. Acts 22 things. Second defense and what? What's the second main thing? Plot. Remember the plot to kill him? That's Acts 23. So those are the 2 things in Acts 23. Acts 24, who's the key personality in chapter 24? Well, we have a number. We have Felix, Governor Felix, and we have our favorite liar, Tertullus. And then we have the three areas in which Paul witnessed to Felix, which we looked at. And then tonight we have phase 2, where he was before Festus, and Paul said, and so you should look over your page 29 excursus, that Paul was willing to die if he had done anything wrong. Just look over, know that Festus now brings King Agrippa up to speed. It gives him an overview, and now we'll get into that chapter 26, but that's up to chapter 25. And we have 3 chapters to go. We're going to finish the book of Acts by the grace of God. Okay. We can't do a whole class on just